and I let it count up a little bit. This is a little bit of count up time for Cecil to snip. The last thing we want to do is cut off any good talk for a little
Sure.
while. For a little while, Paul, I was singing Staying Alive, which I guess, if you're in Texas, especially Austin and Houston, and if you're in California and you're in some other states, that's important.
Well, yeah.
And, I think we were talking about disc golf when we were counting up. Disc golf's great. Get out, dude. Get out to nature. And thank you, everybody. Here we go. Should you be worried about a Dalvin Cook holdout? That and more this week on the couch. It's Paul Charchian week, so there's Minnesota news. The news is Dalvin Cook's not going to report to team activities until he has a reasonable extension. Paul, is he going to get that reasonable extension?
I believe in time he will, but it probably won't happen soon, and it's going to test the mettle of fantasy owners. And I already see that there are some people that are dropping him out of that tier that he had been in with Ezekiel Elliott and Alvin Kamara. But I will be very surprised because the leverage dynamic is very apparent to running backs. They just don't have it at SIG, and we've seen this play out so many times. The vast majority of the big running back contracts that we've seen over the past 3 and 4 years have ultimately been regretted by their teams.
Right.
Whether it's Freeman or Johnson or Bell or Gurley, teams end up trying to bail out of those, and the Vikings are going to know that. They have a little bit of cap. They don't have very much cap flexibility at all for this year, but next year they're currently $32 million under, so they're in okay shape going forward, and they really do understand. And you and I talked about this at this time last year, Sig.
Mm-hmm.
His offense is not built around Kirk Cousins. His offense is built around Dalvin Cook. That really needs him to function. And people are acting like Alexander Mattison can just go walk in and be Dalvin Cook. And he's a good back, but Dalvin Cook is a really special back. And it will not function the same way without him. I believe they will get something done here. It's going to, it'll probably be a long process. Vikings traditionally don't make signings this time of year. I believe that the urgency will ramp up much closer to training camp.
Right.
And that's the point at which I think you're going to see Dalvin Cook get signed. So I do believe it'll happen. There's no guarantees, and I don't have. Sometimes I get good in Viking intel on this. I don't have any inside. I don't have any inside information on this. This is just my finger in the wind, following the team for a long time and just evaluating the landscape. I think they'll find a way to get something done with Dalvin Cook.
Yeah, Courtney Cronin brought up. I think it was 4 different players that in the Spielman regime they've signed on the eve of camp. They've signed the extensions like Xavier Rhodes and Stephon Diggs. I can't remember all of them. And I think that this is going back to old school fantasy football logic, which is fade the holdout. There was a time, remember, Paul, that we were like, hold out, schmold out. They're going to pay him. They're going to show up. Everything's going to be fine. And I think the Le'Veon Bell situation switched our psychology over to the other side now, where we're scared. And the new CBA, and I do think you bring up a point that people need to take away from this, which is the drop off from Dalvin Cook to Alexander Mattison is significant, and this isn't necessarily an Austin Eckler situation like last year, where Mattison can have lasting value with Cook. So we all underdrafted Austin Eckler last year, even if there was no Melvin Gordon holdout.
Right.
Maybe that's the takeaway. All right, let's get into something you put out recently of your players that you like more than ADP. And that's really where we're at in the fantasy football calendar. ADP is set, but there are inefficiencies. And when training camp comes and when everybody really tunes in, those inefficiencies are going to shrink. This is the advantage of doing early drafts. If you get into some best ball drafts and things like that, you can take advantage of that. ADP inefficiencies. Let's go over some of your favorites, Paul.
Well, let's begin at the quarterback position.
Yeah.
And I think Jimmy Garoppolo is sitting on an improved fantasy season. Love the additions I like the addition that they made of Brandon Ayuk, and I think that will pay off pretty immediately for them as well. But they also get a previously banged up set of wide receivers that potentially come back and could play well here. And of course, we've got a really good tight end, and Garoppolo just another year under his belt. And we're not 5 deep at running back anymore. I believe this is I believe that Kyle Shanahan, by the way, that's also part of what motivates me in this. Kyle Shanahan's awesome. He's the best. He's arguably the best offensive mind in football right now. And I absolutely want to back him. I want to back his quarterback, and just believe there's a ton of room for Deebo Samuel to get better in a year, a year into the game, and just feel like he's for where he is going right now, which is, I believe, round. I had it in my tweet. Let me think here.
12, but he's
12?
free. I mean, look,
Yeah.
in terms of quarterback drafting, he's going to be outside of the top 15 or 18 in most drafts.
Yeah, round 12. That's, to me, that feels like great value for him. So yeah, I like Jimmy Garoppolo and feel like he can be your quarterback one. I don't think you have to treat Jimmy Garoppolo like most owners are right now as their backup quarterback, as your contingency quarterback. I think he can be your lead quarterback, and I think you'll be all right.
Well, I'll make my best argument in favor of your stance on Jimmy Garoppolo, Charch, which is, here's the schedule. Have you seen San Francisco's schedule to open?
No, throw it at me.
Arizona, at the Jets, at the Giants, Philadelphia, and Miami.
Man, wow. That's how great does that feel?
Yeah, that's a takeoff. That's the air traffic control saying you're cleared for takeoff. There's not really, and those San Francisco Arizona games last year were some of the most entertaining games of the year. But there's a lot of suspect secondaries there. And if you think of Kyle Shanahan as somebody who's going to craft a game plan, dial up plays, add twists to plays to take advantage of weaknesses of his opponent, there's some weaknesses there. It should be interesting. Miami, with the two cornerbacks now, they have the best cornerback combination in the league, but there's still a lot to attack in that defense. Otherwise, Jets, Giants, absolutely. Philadelphia, they've got Darius Slay now. But so I think that's the best argument for Jimmy Garoppolo. And also, I think that this is what I'm spending a lot of time doing right now, Paul, is I'm looking at that first 3 to 5 weeks of the schedule, especially week 1, honestly, because I think you're going to see a lot of turnover and perhaps the gulf between the teams that are well-oiled machines and come out of the gate strong and the teams that are still getting everything figured out is going to be wide. San Francisco is a team with tons of continuity. I think you're right to point out Deebo Samuel, someone that's going to take a step forward this year. You said they're going to get back Jalen Hurd, hopefully, Trent Taylor, hopefully. And we'll see. Even Raheem Mostert could be someone that gets off to a hot start. So I like that chip on the San Francisco offense. The concern I've been saying this offseason, Paul, about Jimmy Garoppolo is just how's his confidence. The last time we saw him, Paul, it's one of the more indelible images of recent Super Bowls of Garoppolo overthrowing Emmanuel Sanders.
Yes.
And that's a long time to live with that. Plus, he had to hear that, I was looking into Tom Brady. And I know, we all know that Kyle Shanahan, if Kirk Cousins wasn't signed to an extension, we would have been talking about Kirk Cousins potentially as the San Francisco quarterback next year. So how does Garoppolo deal with that? I think it could make him even better. I think he could go right into the fire and pull the sword out of the stone, or whatever mixed metaphor you want. But quarterbacks are deep this year, and you can pick and choose. You can have your targets. You can have easy fallback targets. And I still think, Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes look pretty good if you don't have to spend a first-round pick on them for the advantage they give. And there's the people that are going to be Kyler Murray folks. Deshaun Watson's falling a little bit. People still, the quarterback. This is again why you want to go super flex leagues. You want to go with quarterback leagues and other new foundations of fantasy football. Like we'll talk about Guillotine Leagues a little bit later. I was thinking, by the way, Paul, because so many people ask me about all the things you brought up over the last couple of years. You're becoming like the Willy Wonka of fantasy football. You've got the new everlasting gobstopper, whatever it is, to make fantasy football fun. But drafting fantasy football fun. I know you like, and Buffalo, they're going to like Zach Moss, and he doesn't have the typical rookie hype because he wasn't one of those top 5 backs. Tell me a story about how Zach Moss will make your fantasy football team better this year.
Yeah, and currently going off the board in round 13. This stat alone should make anybody feel great about taking him in round 13, and I would certainly take him before that. Zach Moss. Last year, inside the 5, the carry distribution for Buffalo, Devin Singletary got 3 carries from inside the 5. And by the way, only scored on 1 of those carries. All of the rest of the running back carries went to Frank Gore, and that was 18 carries from inside the 5. 18. Now, where Zach Moss is, and where Frank Gore is in his career, Zach Moss is probably a lot better. And Zach Moss is going to convert. If he gets those same 18, he converts that into potentially double-digit touchdowns. And you're telling me I can get a guy with 10 touchdown upside in the 13th round? Well, I'm really interested in that. I'm a buyer. And who's to say, by the way, that Josh Allen, if they've got and Zach Moss he's a big bodied guy. He's built for inside running. He's absolutely Utah's all-time leading rusher and touchdown scorer, might I add. Mm-hmm. And if Zach Moss is really productive here, who's to say that Josh Allen's going to keep sniping close touchdowns in close? He may not. They may just decide to give them to Zach Moss. So that's why I feel really good about Zach Moss's potential to get to double-digit touchdowns, Sig, is usage really should be there. Singletary's not built for that stuff. This is a young, promising, fascinating new offense. So the first time in so long, you feel great about having a Buffalo Bill on your roster. And here's the one guy nobody's talking about, and I think is being dramatically underdrafted, Zach Moss.
Well, you're right to create the expectation that Zach Moss is going to get the goal line carries that Frank Gore got and be much more successful. Zach Moss is just a fun player. He's actually an excellent pass blocker and receiver also. He fits really well with Devin Singletary. And painting the picture, I mean, he's not going to take over for Devin Singletary. He's not going to be a 20 or 25 touch a game back. But if he gets 10 or 12 touches and a touchdown every other week, or when they're inside of the 5, his number gets called. Maybe with Josh Allen, it's like when they're at the 1. I would be curious, someone should run these numbers real fast. Like how many of Josh Allen's rushing touchdowns, and not rushing touchdowns where he broke the pocket and scored on a pass play call, but actually designed. Were they after a Frank Gore failure at the 1? Because I feel like there were so many times it was frustrating enough that Devin Singletary wasn't getting his number called inside the 5, but it was even worse when Frank Gore, and I love Frank Gore, but he wasn't converting those carries. And if Zach Moss is a hoss. He's tough to bring down. So, and he's not getting the rookie hype of the top 5. So he could absolutely be, look, with running back, the drop-off is so steep, even early, that Zach Moss, in hindsight, could be a fine running back too if he's getting those scoring opportunities, if he's getting 2 or 3 or 4 receptions a week. I'll be interested to see if he's the running back in any kind of no huddle situation or these 2-minute drill situations, because if that's the case, that alone could be enough to more than justify what he can do for your fantasy team. And since you brought up Buffalo, another team with a ton of continuity. They were number 1 in ESPN's continuity rankings, where they rank the teams by the number of snaps lost. Sean McDermott and his program is fully realized now, and they're going for it. So that's going to be a fun story to watch.
Well, let me ask you this. So if I like Zach Moss this much, I feel like to some degree I've got to balance that with Devin Singletary. And I think Singletary he's a good back. I'm not trying to take anything away from him. But sometimes if you have to score from distance as a running back, it really it creates a downside that many other backs don't have, and we've seen this before, where if you're not the goal line back and you need to score from distance, you have a 3 touchdown season. That I think it's created a new lower floor for Devin Singletary that a lot of people aren't baking into his evaluation right now. And I've got Singletary right now going off as running back 24 on my rankings, and I think that to me that feels like I'm a little more pessimistic than most people. How do you feel about Zach Moss impacting Devin Singletary?
I mean, I don't think that Zach Moss is necessarily the one way that Zach Moss is going to impact Singletary's weekly floor and ceiling. I mean, obviously, Singletary's not going to get the goal line carries vacated by Frank Gore, but that's similar to his outlook from last year. Yeah. It's just that Zach Moss is maybe a more viable pass receiver, and Zach Moss is just a player with younger legs, although my hesitation on Zach Moss for Dynasty, for rookie drafts, is he just doesn't have great burst. And I think that kind of flaw in an outlook, it's like watching David Montgomery with the Bears. I just think it keeps a running back from ever being the answer or the guy in a backfield when there's so much fresh legs, speed coming into the league at running back every year. All that being said, I think I'm with you on Singletary, where I think I might have him as low as running back 27 or 28. The best thing that Singletary has going for him, if you want to draft him, is he looked really good last year. He looks like a good NFL running back.
Yeah, he belongs.
He belongs. And now, if Moss is getting maybe, again, 10 or 12 touches, where some weeks Gore was only getting maybe 8 or 10. But see, the thing is, if you look at Gore, there were weeks he was getting 11 carries, 15 carries. Like there was one week when they thumped Denver that Singletary had 21 carries and Gore had 15.
Yeah.
So there's still room there. So I'll just put this out there. There's room there for Singletary as a 4th or 5th round pick to hit, in the sense that you plug him in your lineup every week as you're running back 2 or flex, and you're going to be okay with that. He's still going to get you 80 or 100 total yards. You remember last year he had that hamstring injury early, and he didn't miss a beat when he came back. And he could be even better in year 2. And there's room for Moss to be a hit, but there's more room for Moss to return profit on his draft pick than Singletary. But if Buffalo's offense takes a leap forward, because what you're really looking at here is lighter boxes with Stephon Diggs, and everything should be easier for this offense. Year 2 of a rebuild offensive line. Everything should be better for this team, and the defense continues to gel. This team should win the division. They should be a double-digit win team. All that tells me more running back carries, more favorable game scripts, and they could both beat return value on ADP. Because the thing is, with a player like Devin Singletary entering his second year, we can't discount the possibility that he's just even better. That was his rookie year.
Yes.
And even if he's getting the same touches, he could become more efficient. And especially because this offense should be more efficient. I know, turning the page to the wide receiver you called out. And again, folks, you're following Paul Charchian on Twitter, and you know what's going on. This is one of my favorites. And this is one that I think embodies, for me, a theory of fantasy football that I usually tap into when I'm writing my players that can win your league. Absolutely. This is a player that could win your league. Give us your favorite wide receiver ADP value.
That is Mecole Hardman, who's going off the board in round 10 right now. And Sig, I think there's a lot of hesitation around Hardman, because if you tried to pick that game when he has that 50-yard reception, you probably got burned, and he probably had a 1 catch for 13-yard game. And there were a lot of people that sort of dabbled in Hardman last year, and just the payoff wasn't routinely there. I think it all changes in year 2. I thought the kid played, when they gave him the ball, he was absolutely electric. And I always want to try to find people on my team that are just special players.
Right.
Players that can do things on the field that other people can't do. Mecole Hardman's got that. I mean, it's absurd that Kansas City's got so many players that are like that, and he's one of them. I see the playing time ramping up in a big, big way in year 2, and he becomes an absolute factor in what's going to be the highest scoring offense in the NFL, and somebody who, with more playing time, just becomes somebody that can. I don't think we're going to have as many of these 1 catch, 13-yard games. I think his downside games now turn into 3 catches for 30 yards, and his upside game turn into 7 catches for 180 yards when everything clicks for Hardman. He's just such a special player that I think people are looking a little too much at a rookie season in which he was used sparingly, and not enough about projecting how this year is going to be different and what he can bring to the table. Now, he's a polarizing player. Where do you stand on Mecole Hardman?
Write him in your draft plan in pen. This is one of those players. And I would also throw, and I'm giving a preview. I usually write my players that can win your league in August. I may write something a little earlier this year because it's been on my mind lately. Another player I would put into this category is someone like J.K. Dobbins, and I have some others where from a really basic standpoint. And the nice thing, unlike Dobbins, Hardman played in the NFL last year, so you can use this. So, Paul, let's get back to the basic premise of fantasy football, right?
Yeah.
Is you watch football and you see a guy that jumps off the screen, and you say, I want that guy on my team. Like, I want my team to do well when that guy does well. That was Mecole Hardman last year, even though the Chiefs used him less than we expected when Tyreek Hill was out. They used him. And look, they brought back Sammy Watkins on a good deal. Sammy Watkins is probably another guy just because of the, hitch your wagon to the Kansas City offense however you can. Like, I'm looking at ADPs for Sammy Watkins and Damian Williams saying, I'll sign up for that too. If you did a draft and you said, I ended up taking Patrick Mahomes in the second round, and then I took Damian Williams and Sammy Watkins and Mecole Hardman in like the 8th, 9th, and 10th round. Did I do okay? Was that too many Chiefs? No, that's not too many Chiefs. It's not at all, because this is going to be a highly efficient offense. But like, even Sammy Watkins was brought back for like $9 million. That's not chump change when they restructured his deal, and he can actually outperform what he was going to make. The Chiefs did him a solid. Because if he has a good year, he's going to make more money than the, I think, 14 or so million he was going to get. But you watch Mecole Hardman, and the dude just translates in terms. It's just like Tyreek Hill in a way. He doesn't have necessarily the dog in him that Tyreek Hill has when it comes to time to win a ball, to catch point or something like that. Yeah. But his speed, guys just can't handle him. And what I always point out when Hardman comes up in conversations, Paul, is he's new to the wide receiver position. It's only his third year last year playing wide receiver. He's still learning how to play wide receiver. And very simply, if you have a really good offense and a really good talent, and we don't quite know how it's going to work out, this is like the powder and the spark, right? If maybe the powder and the spark never quite meet, but if they do, boom, and your fantasy football team is going to very much flourish. So I think you're right, just like the point I was making on Singletary. Hardman could take that step forward next year, so that even if their plan going into the year was for Hardman just to be sprinkled in because they have the same wide receiver core returning, he could say, no, I'm too good now, and that's what happens. I mean, he's going to be incredible. This is a player that I'm trying to get in dynasty leagues and trades right now, and people are very smartly holding on to him.
Well, if in theory his owners have his people that already are rostering Hardman probably already think like us, but maybe not always. And we're seeing an upside that other people don't have. And I like your analogy here, Tinder and Spark. I just feel like at some point talent's just the Tinder waiting, and I'll gravitate towards. I just want guys on my roster that have freakish talent that jumps off the page. I love your Dobbins analogy because it's really right on. Dobbins looks to be a freakish talent. He is as elusive and ankle breaking as any rookie we've seen come into the league. It's since Saquon Barkley, and he looks like a really special player. And sometimes I just want special players on my team. Yes. I think that's a great analogy. Sure, it's a crowded backfield. Don't care. I just want great players.
Exactly. And then in this Tinder and Spark, like the part, another way you can go on with this metaphor is the quality of the offense is like the oxygen that feeds the fire, Yeah. So that's why maybe if J.K. Dobbins was drafted by the Jets, we would be like, well, but it's the Ravens, and again with these plans, right? The Ravens may go into the season, well, we're going to give Ingram, 12 to 15 carries. He's going to get 2 or 3 receptions a game. He's going to be the goal line back, and Gus Edwards is still going to figure in there. Justice Hill's going to figure in there. And then the first game, on his third carry, because Dobbins is going to get mixed in, he breaks a 70-yard touchdown. And I've said this over and over and over again. You can go back and watch Mark Ingram runs last year, and if Dobbins gets those same carries with the same holes, Dobbins is taking those to the house.
Yeah,
I mean, he's going to house those, and then you tear up the plan, and you say, "Well, that was the plan." And look, Dobbins, if he's just getting 8 or 10 touches a week, could still be someone you plug in your lineup every week because of how much at a disadvantage defenses are against the Ravens. It's an unbelievably difficult defense to defend, and if Marquise Brown is healthy, that's another guy. Again, Marquise Brown, take him. Yeah, there are players that we say you should target. And then there are players that you should be willing to take a round or two before ADP because ADP is just wrong, and Marquise Brown will fit into that too. So
that's what that should be. That should be the motto of the offseason. ADP is wrong, and it is wrong. It's 100% wrong, and it's in anybody. You can't be a slave to it. And go get your guys. We've coined, because we're juveniles. We've coined this phrase: reach around.
Yes.
Go give yourself a reach around on your favorite players.
Yes.
And, just go get your guys. And who cares that, this guy's normally going to go off around 12. If you want Mecole Hardman and his ADP is around 10, take him around 8. Just make sure you got him. If he's your guy, just go get your guys. Go love your team.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
man, the rosters that I look back on and I'm always disappointed by are the ones where I really just tried to find value and just, man, just go get your guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And these the players excite you, and just because we're being juvenile, it's early, but we can be juvenile before noon. I always like when you mention that, Paul. I remember the saddest football game I ever watched. Do you know what I'm going to say when I say the saddest football game I ever watched?
Well, no, I'm a Viking fan. That's most of my games.
And there's a Vikings game. It is a Vikings game. It is the saddest football game I've ever watched. It was a Monday night game. Somebody wanted the Vikings to trade for Josh Freeman, and somebody else didn't. And I think whoever it was that didn't said, you are going to play Josh Freeman. You got your way. Josh Freeman's a Viking. And now, like, the week he joins the team, you remember that game? The Freeman?
I do.
John Gruden. I can't remember who it was that had a reach around sack. He said that was a reach around sack because they reached around. Anyway, we're juvenile here. But absolutely, ADP. Well, it's just like in an auction, right? ADP and auction values can map to each other, where if you wrote down that somebody's projected as a $7 player and they're sitting out there at $3, you shouldn't bid them up to $4 just because you had them as a $7 value. If you don't want them, don't take them.
Yeah.
Don't let the rest of your league decide who's on your team, right? So when a player has an 8th round ADP and they're still there in the 10th, you're letting the other teams in your league decide that you're taking that player. You're taking a player because everyone else is saying, I don't want him. Is that a good reason to take a player? I mean, you should have a reason separate from that, and then you take the player. But absolutely be willing. It's one of the other adages I always say is, once they start playing, reaches become values and values become reaches. I mean, it's just it flips really quick. And this year, I think it's going to flip so quick that people are going to have whiplash, and probably we're going to also have a really interesting week 2 waiver wire run. And again, I think the ESPN continuity rankings that just came out are a good breadcrumb trail to start thinking about who's going to start hot in the schedule, and who's going to have a rough time of it early. Okay, now we get to tight end. And, this again is a guy, I see a theme here, Paul, because this is a guy that if you were watching his team last year, especially in the second half of the year, you would say, who's that? Wait, that looks like Derrick Henry, but that's not Derrick Henry. So tell us about your favorite tight end.
It's Jonnu Smith. And Jonnu Smith came on strong at the end of last year, when Delanie Walker ended up missing so much time last season, and they ultimately ended up cutting Delanie Walker this offseason. And I think it's in no small part because Jonnu Smith was he was a force at the end of the season. From week 14 and then through the playoffs, we saw him score 3 times. He had a 60-yard game, a 63-yard game. And then there was this as well. I ended up having a conversation at the combine with a Titans coach, and started talking about tight ends and how, they mixed in at that point. Delanie Walker was still on the team, but we thought he'd go. They mixed in a little Anthony Ferkster and Cole Pruitt, and we're talking about different guys. And then we get to Jonnu Smith, and the eyes light up. And he said, "You saw what he did at the end of last year, right?" Yeah. You know what he can do, right? I'm like, yeah. It's the focus. The focus there really looks like it's going to be on Jonnu Smith, and this is a team that's crying for a second receiver. And the second, they don't, they're not going to throw the running backs much. So the upside for me on Jonnu Smith is really, really high in a season in which there's all of these great tight ends that I think have the ability to jump from deep late round into relevancy. Jonnu Smith, who's currently going off the board in round 14, effectively free, has got, I believe, tight end 1 upside to him. And in a competent offense in which there's not a lot of other people to take balls away from him, he's the best tight end on roster. And I think he really did flash and pass the eye test at the end of last year. So I'm very high on Jonnu Smith as a favorite late target. What do you think? Are you with me on this?
Well, at tight end, I mean, I still like, when I've been doing early drafts, Paul, the second round's not great for running backs, and the wide receivers in the second round are as good as the wide receivers in the 4th round or 5th round. So I've been liking taking quarterback or tight end. It depends on your scoring. So I'm fine with George Kittle in the second round. I'm fine with Kelsey in the second round. I'm fine with Patrick Mahomes. I'm fine with Lamar Jackson. And that effectively precludes late round tight end as a strategy. But I still think if you take that quarterback or tight end in the second round, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking for your sleeper. I like Blake Jarwin late, a little bit earlier. I like Hayden Hurst as a guy who could just explode this year if he stays healthy. There's a lot of potential right answers at tight end, and just because you take Kelsey or Kittle in the second doesn't mean you should skip these guys. And absolutely, the thing about Johnny Smith is when you watch him, I think there was that 1 week he got a carry. And he was like a buffalo on the plains. Nobody was going to take him down. And it's exciting too, because I see the alignment of Henry and AJ Brown and Johnny Smith as these big bullies. And over the course of a game, tackling these guys sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And by the fourth quarter, you hate seeing these guys come at you. What could really allow Johnny Smith to take off is if defenses start to focus on A.J. Brown. He's not sneaking up on him anymore. Now, and of course, Corey Davis is still there. But Johnny Smith could absolutely become more of a focal point of the passing attack. And as he showed last year, he doesn't need a lot of touches. He's that big play tight end. So he should absolutely be on your list. Yeah, I would say, in a draft plan, Johnny Smith or Blake Jarwin should be on your roster, no matter who your number one tight end is, because either of them could hit in a way so that you can trade your number one tight end,
right,
or trade them, and the talent's there. Another thing that's weird looking at ADP, Paul, is people just aren't buying Ryan Tannehill. He's going like 18th quarterback sometimes, and he was a top 5 quarterback last year. I understand regression, and we didn't see him do it before and all that, but I'm okay with going into the season with Ryan Tannehill as my number one quarterback if I'm going late quarterback to see what happens. He does open up with Denver, but then gets Jacksonville, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, Buffalo. That's maybe you wait and trade for Ryan Tannehill.
He's got a trickier. Tennessee's got a trickier passing start to the season than most teams, but I wouldn't necessarily let that stop me from taking Ryan Tannehill. And their schedule does get easier after that, of course, as it usually is the case. So yeah, Tannehill's fascinating, and you're right, not really getting a lot of love from people. And this is still an offense that running game sets up a lot of easy passes.
Yeah,
and that's that it really puts Tannehill in a position to do very well. And you're right, second half of last year, and depending on your scoring system, he was my number 4 finishing quarterback in the second half of the season. And number 4, I mean, going off the board, like you said, quarterback 18. There's tons of value there.
It's interesting to see, and one of the things I'll try to do if I have time is look at current ADPs, and there wasn't really an ADP for Ryan Tannehill last year, so it doesn't count. But just seeing where the fantasy football hive mind is deciding, like an example is AJ Green, right? AJ Green, after we knew he was hurt last year, with Andy Dalton as his quarterback, was still going 5th, 6th round in the draft.
Yeah.
Now he's not hurt that I've heard of.
Right.
Quarterback. He's got Joe Burrow, and he's going even later. So you do this. You put it on the scale, and you say, well, is that fair? Is that, I mean, are we just all collectively moving on from AJ Green and looking at that? And I think with Ryan Tannehill, we can retroactively say his ADP should have been whatever, quarterback 8 or 10 or something. And it's still lower than that. Okay, kicker. And I like this, Paul, because because you've been one of the people that the buck stops at a fantasy website. And I'm not, there's still Joe Bryant and David Dodds. But, writing up kickers, it's not exactly the most stimulating fantasy content. So I write up the kicker section for all 32 of our team reports. I do.
Okay, I do. All right. Nice.
And I just got to say, you nailed it, the kicker, and it is the kicker. Who's for people who still play in leagues with kickers, bless your heart, who's the kicker to target? Young-Ho
Koo from the Falcons. You get an accurate kicker who plays for an always competent offense, and somebody who came in middle of last year, finished through the second half of the season as the 7th highest scoring kicker, and didn't even play the whole second half. He was still the 7th highest scoring kicker, if memory serves. Mm-hmm. And you can get him effectively free. I think he's going off the board in round 20.
Yeah.
So, which means he's undrafted in many leagues. And you get the Falcons kicker. The Falcons kicker traditionally has been, with Matt Bryant for years, traditionally been a very high scoring spot, and it will be again here. So I think he's that, for me, that last pick of your draft, and you're looking for your kicker. And here's a guy that nobody even knows, can't spell his name. Right. I might have just mispronounced it. I don't know, but I like him as my favorite sleeper kicker.
Yes, for the record, It is, and I always have to look these things up. It is Young Wei Koo.
Thank you.
But listen, and then we'll steer back to more relevant fantasy topics, although this is still fantasy football. Okay, he played half the season, 8 games. In those 8 games, he had 26 field goal attempts, and he made 23 of them. So obviously, you can do the math, it's pretty easy. He would have 52 field goal attempts and 46 makes at that pace. And I'm not saying he's going to keep up that pace, but remember, this also coincided with the Falcons' defense getting a lot better with Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris. So Harrison Butker actually led the league in field goal attempts last year. You know how many he had? 38.
Jeez, man.
So Young Wei Koo was on pace to have 14 more field goal attempts than any other kicker in the league. He was on pace to have 12 more makes than any other field goal kicker in the league. Butker made 34 of 38. So yeah, just on that alone, Young Wei Koo should be going in the top 5 kickers. So in the 18th round instead of the 20th round.
I'm totally stealing that stat. That's awesome.
Yeah,
I did not even know that. I was more right than I knew. Thank you.
Exactly. Okay, couple of more topics before we go off the rails here. Ezekiel Elliott.
Yeah.
And look, if anything, I mean, we have Rudy Gobert to thank, I guess, in hindsight, in some ways, for putting coronavirus on everyone's minds whenever he was wiping people's mics with his, secretions and things. Now with Ezekiel Elliott, I think, who he may have a bone to pick with his agent because he didn't want his information to get out. And then his mom came out, and there were some more details, by the way. His agent said he's asymptomatic. I don't know if that's truly clinically asymptomatic, but I hope so. His mom said that his mom and his sister were exposed to somebody who 3 days later tested positive for coronavirus, and they all got tested, and he was the only one that was positive. And I put out there quickly, kind of a knee-jerk reaction, Paul, that, I mean, look, all other things being equal, we'd rather hear that our player has never contracted coronavirus than he has. Now, and one of the things people need to keep in mind also is Von Miller, who contracted coronavirus. So I think we have Von Miller, Brian Allen, who was the first player that was reported, the center for the Rams, and Ezekiel Elliott. I do not believe we've heard any other reports of specific NFL players. I know the report yesterday was several Texans and several Cowboys. No coincidence that it's Texas, with Texas being a place now where the numbers are trying to go up. But you brought up a point also that a lot of other people brought up to me, which is, if it is, and sorry, I'm getting scattered here. Von Miller said he was sidelined for 17 days. I mean, he just took 17 days, and Von Miller's also asthmatic, and he said that in May, so I think a good month after he had gotten coronavirus, that he was still having shortness of breath when he was running. He was still not feeling like himself. So one of the things people need to know is that if a player is coronavirus positive during the season, it isn't just as simple as, well, 2 weeks, he'll sit out like the flu, he'll be back in 2 weeks. It can take a player a while to get back to themselves, depending on other things, potentially with their health, or, somewhat still mysterious of why coronavirus hits some people so much harder than others. DeMaurice Smith and the NFLPA had their conference call yesterday. They had mentioned that the plan is for players to have, they expect a saliva test to be available by the end of next month, and testing them three times a week. So, there's going to be some comprehensive plans here, because one of the other things that is very scary is the idea that, say, on Friday, whatever, Mecole Hardman tests positive, and then the next thing you know, all of the Chiefs receivers are all positive because of the position group room. And there's going to be a lot of new scenarios. And we talked about this on Twitter yesterday, that having IR spots, temporary spots for players that are quarantined for COVID might be something to think about. Having some sort of thing if the season gets paused or ended early to determine your fantasy football champion is something to think about. But what about the idea, Paul, that maybe this is a good thing for Ezekiel Elliott, and maybe this is, while we're this far out from the season, is a positive, so to speak, when we look at a fantasy football stock?
Well, the angle is, and I think there's something to it, is assuming, we don't know yet, but assuming you can only ever get COVID-19 one time and that your immunity would kick in after that. This is the one fantasy relevant player that is, in theory, not in danger of getting it during the season. he's getting it now. And if you can get it out of the way now, that he's the one player you could feel best about. It makes a certain amount of sense, and we don't know for sure that you'd only ever get it one time, but that we hope that that's the case. We really hope that that's the case, and to this point, that appears to be the case. So Ezekiel Elliott becomes maybe the safest of the safest fantasy pick you can make. A guy that is all but guaranteed to not miss time due to the coronavirus.
Yeah, well, I think watching to see and the learning that he was asymptomatic is a good sign, and then watching practice participation when camp opens, may there be camps opening. I think absolutely it's something to watch, because if what this should have been putting people on notice yesterday was players are going to test positive during the season. There's no way that they can stop that from happening. So it's better to happen now than later in the season, assuming that there's no long-term effects and that immunity conferred is lasting immunity, or at least lasting immunity for like 6 months. But we don't know these things for sure yet. We're still out in the mystery, the forest of uncertainty with so many things with coronavirus. And then again, I want to say, folks, please pay attention to the numbers in your state, pay attention to the numbers in your local area, take precautions, masks, and especially if you're inside for a longer period. My wife actually, Paul, did the Johns Hopkins contact tracer course online.
I don't know what that is. What is that?
So contact tracing is hopefully a way that we're going to keep this contained. It is, if someone tests positive for COVID, they start contacting people that have spent time with that person, what people that they work with, or people that maybe they went out to this club, because how it's spread is aerosols, droplets mainly. I think they've said the surface.
Yeah, the surface
is less.
Right.
So like imagine at a club, right? When you're out at the club, in the club, and you're like, hey, you know what I mean? Like, and everybody's in all that aerosols mixing. So they would tell everybody that was at the club. So you trace out. This is what they've been doing in other countries very effectively. This is how they can say, like in Korea, keeping with the Korea theme, we can trace all of these infections back to like this church, this one session. I'm sure there was a thing about the choir practice up in Washington State, where like one person showed up and something like 40 people out of the 60 were infected, because of singing, and so on. So anyway, take it seriously, folks, if not for yourself, for the people around you. Because I saw some people suggesting, well, are players going to start having coronavirus parties, like chickenpox parties, where they all get it? And I think that's just, I mean, it's a thought, we're brainstorming, but they have families. There are coaches. Dave Gettleman was wearing the mask put on the mask during the draft because he's a cancer survivor. Like, there are people working for these teams and around these teams that are higher risk.
High risk, absolutely. Look at virtually every coach.
Yeah. So I think that's not going to happen. I don't think players are going to preemptively get themselves infected. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't some players who may go out on their own and unilaterally try to do that, but I don't think that's the plan. Okay, before we go off the rails, last thing. And I know there's a bigger announcement, a bigger unveil coming, but we've talked a lot, and I'm happy to be the unofficial spokesperson for Guillotine Leagues.
Thank you.
Because, well, it's just, it again, it brings back like the heart-thumping part of fantasy football. If you can think back to any time your team's in the playoffs and the screws get tightened and you're watching the 4:00 Eastern games and you just need one more big play from somebody, and the heart-thumping part of it, that's every week in Guillotine Leagues. And the waiver wire adds that. And it's also, it's funny because I think, Paul, one of the ways that DFS was marketed was, well, you're tired of, my week 6 or week 7, my team's out of it. Well, DFS, you're back in it every week. That's Guillotine League. I don't know, Paul, how you could run the numbers on this from early Guillotine Leagues, but I imagine a lot of people who win Guillotine Leagues have terrible drafts. Just, you can botch your whole draft, and just by scrapping and hanging around and making a few good waiver wire pickups and barely eking someone out because one of their players got hurt, it does make the injury luck really, really painful. But like the Guillotine League that we all did together last year, I remember seeing some teams that were just riding high, like one of the top scorers every week, and then one week The bottom
all
can
it
just
takes.
drop out.
1 week.
So Guillotine Leagues coming soon, hopefully to a fantasy football playground near you, thanks to Paul Charchian.
Well, we think so, yeah. I mean, we should probably just explain what a guillotine league is for anybody.
Yes, again, just in case, because
you and I have talked about it plenty, but we do this 4 times a year. The premise on the guillotine league is you start with 17 teams at the beginning of the year, no head-to-head, and every week the low-scoring team gets eliminated, and their entire roster goes to the waiver wire. And so it creates an absolute pandemonium on the waiver wire as a whole draft of players hits the waiver wire at the end of week 1. Then you have fascinating decisions. If Saquon Barkley goes belly up in week 1, he's on the waiver wire. That team's a low-scoring team. He hits the waiver wire, and now you're looking at a decision how do I spend my fab? It's Saquon Barkley. Do I put all my fab in, or do I hold it and try to have more money later? And fascinating decisions. And to your point, it really gives you flexibility on course correcting for mistakes you make in the draft. And if you really thought this guy was going to be good, he's not good. Well, here comes another great player at his position. You can just go start spending fab to go correct your mistakes. And so that's it's absolutely thrilling. And every week you're on the edge of your seat. You never feel safe. It's just anxiety in a guillotine league. You're never safe. And that part of it is so much fun. It sounds horrible, I know, but just the knowing every week I gotta just get through this week is exhilarating in a way that you don't get when it's week 6 and you're 4-2, and the worst thing can happen is you're 4-3. Here with guillotine leagues, the worst thing can happen is you're out.
You're out.
And
yeah.
It is so emotional and so tense. It's like nothing else in fantasy football.
Yeah, the mortality. It's the mortality hanging over you. And every lineup decision, there were lineup decisions last year that I'll wake up in the middle of the night. Why did I play Chase Edmonds the week he got hurt? The waiver wire decisions, and you really have to, I don't want to say pull numbers out of the air, but I think that we're getting more data to understand how people bid in guillotine leagues, but it's a whole new frontier of trying to project other people's psychology.
Yeah.
And then even the Monday night sweats, if I had nothing to do with it, if I was safe, because there's always like, all right, now there's no way that I can get passed up on Monday night. Just watching who was going to get eliminated was exciting. It's a really, really exciting and interesting fantasy football format. It's a magic formula. It's like 90 feet between bases, Paul. I think this format is a magic formula to make fantasy football super, super engaging. And I just look forward to people getting familiar with it. And then, as we've talked about in the past, because in that episode, you introduced a lot of different formats. I know that Tom Kislingberry is doing. I did his show earlier. He does a lot of vampire leagues.
Yeah.
And just the whole idea that we can play around with this and make it fun is exciting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of creative people out there. There's one thing going on that I'm talking to someone about who's making. I don't want to speak anything about the specifics of it, but again, I'm hearing back from people that are innovating in the fantasy football space, and it's not necessarily innovating to come with like algorithms and charts so that you can pinpoint exactly the best values in your draft. It's innovating to make fantasy football fun, to make it appealing to people who maybe don't see a lot of appeal to it right now. Because it just doesn't necessarily scratch the itch that they're looking for, and this is exciting times. And stay tuned to Paul's Twitter and mine and other people, and you'll hear about guillotine leagues. And then we come to the last 10 minutes, and this segment, this part of the show, Paul, I'm having trouble keeping it to 10 minutes lately. But this is like the We Are Human Beings, and always when you and I get together, that is effortless, just to project humanity. And this is a time, again, having everybody on, just opening up a little bit of time to talk about what's happening, because no matter how you feel about it, or what your connection is or lack of connection is to what's going on, you hear, this is like Q, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, right? Something's happening in here, but you're in Minneapolis. So, this is really touching on people's lives, and these aren't debates that are theoretical. These are debates about how are we going to run our community? What are we going to do going forward? Just what's on your mind about this unprecedented time in our history?
Well, I appreciate the forum, and it's been it's been a lot of reflection here in the Twin Cities, as you can imagine. This is not normal for us in Minnesota, and it's been really hard. And if I'm honest with myself, Sig, we had a bit of Minnesota exceptionalism that really died over the last 3 weeks. We had, we're not. I'm not trying to denigrate other parts of the country when I say this, but we're not Confederate flag waving, gun rack guys up here. We really have always been a very progressive, cultured, educated place. We frequently are like places that rank best places to live. This is Minnesota. We've got thriving, thriving jobs. We've got good people. Just things like murdering our citizens is not something that we've normally had to deal with, and it's been a lot of introspection here as we've tried to figure out what it means to be a Minnesotan, what it means to be a person of color, what it means to not be a person of color. We've really it's been a very thoughtful 3 weeks for a lot of people here. The riots were incredibly disheartening, and seeing our city on fire and our most needy parts of Minneapolis being burned down with literally no response from our government, no fire department, no police, was just heartbreaking. And not entirely. I haven't fully processed that, and it's been sad. And the response to try to rebuild those areas has not been trivial. I mean, a lot of good people have gone out, tried to clean up the city and do what they can to help. But our city, blocks and blocks of our city were burned down, and it's really been a moment of an inflection point in the history of Minnesota, and then nationally, and it spread everywhere. Sometimes, you talked about Tinder and Spark, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think the whole nation was Tinder. We provided the spark here in the Twin Cities, and it spread quickly. And there was obviously a lot of pent up, and I think in many cases very valid concerns and emotions that the rest of the nation has latched onto. What do you think? Give me your perspective from the outside.
Oh.
You saw this, and you're watching. The whole world's watching Minnesota burning, Minneapolis burning. What was your perspective as this was going on?
Well, I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind, and I could go on, and I was going to say there's a lot of Freudian stuff here between Tinder and Spark and guillotines. There's a lot there. People need to understand that when there are riots, there is something to that. Mm-hmm. Okay, people don't. And look, there absolutely is a whole layer to this too of like, where did the violent sparks come into these demonstrations? I don't think it was always from the protesters. I think it could have been. I know there's a lot of talk about outside agitators. Sometimes the outside agitators were the police. When the police would take off the riot gear and not escalate. And in New Orleans, we only had one incident of tear gas because they were trying to cross over into Jefferson Parish on the bridge. Interestingly, the bridge that Blackwater would not let people cross after Katrina. Anyway, always. That's one of the other things too in New Orleans, I think, because people have been through it. And there was a lot of hard fought police reform here, like there was in Camden. The communities where you saw the police just really looking after the safety of the protesters as opposed to antagonizing or otherwise being at opposition with the protesters. But with respect specifically to Minnesota, and I think you're right. And look, I was living in Austin for a long time. I think you're right that there are communities who sometimes pride themselves. And look, Minnesota shares a border with Canada. More sensible. When I think of Minnesota, when I think of Minneapolis, Paul, the first thing that pops in my head is, oh, that's the city with all the bike paths.
It's true.
But it's true. No, but it stands for this idea of sensible management of a community. But there can still be things going on that are out of view. I think some of the things we learned about what was it, the 3rd precinct, right? That was the police station they burned down, right? And that was where the police officers that were part of the murder of George Floyd were part of. That there was a lot of practices that a lot of people said, well, yeah, let me tell you about my experience with 3rd Precinct. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was they had a list of broken down by what percentage of police officers live in the community that they police.
Yeah.
And in Minneapolis, it was very low, very low. And that's another issue. And I think it really comes down to, and this is, obviously everything's third rail now. But look, when the NFL comes out and says Black Lives Matter and we were wrong, then I think it's time to have real conversations about this, as opposed to let's just try not to offend anybody. Let's just try to make sure to say something that like the polling. It was funny. Just as a quick aside, after we talked, I think Matt Harmon and I said like the current Democrat Party is like being a quarterback purgatory. Anyway, take that and run with it. Anyway, the point is that messaging and trying to make sure nobody's going to disagree with what I say if I craft it just right. This is not the time for that. This is the time to call it as you see it. And I think you can see in some ways who the police in a lot of communities serve by who's defending the police at this time and who's protesting the police. And it isn't that the police aren't protecting and serving, it's just that they're protecting and serving a segment of the population or a set of values or an idea of what we want our communities to look like and function as, instead of the entire population or the entire community or some shared vision. And maybe that's where we have to get back to, of course, is to have some sort of shared vision. And that's what, full contact in some ways figuring out right now. And if, maybe never the twain shall meet and we don't have a shared vision and we have to figure that out. But this is a time where there's so much pent up frustration. And I tweeted out a Martin Luther King Jr. quote the other day from a piece that basically, I want to pull it up because I don't want to misquote it, but basically, and this is, from a while ago, from the 60s, that he said basically that the revolution, the movement is not just about, he said it's not just a Negro movement, it's about structural, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It's forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, materialism. And this is back in the 60s. This is before we militarized police, This is before a lot of the 80s. This is before a lot of the materialism, a lot of the I would call it like fundamentalist capitalism almost, that like, and this is some of the things we've seen during COVID, it's like, what are our lives about? I mean, is it about generating production and revenue, or is it about like our communities and connections to people and uplifting each other? And these are the conversations that we're having. And anyway, at the end of the quote, it suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced, and here we are facing it again. But I think that we have a moment in the conversation now where we're having actual progress. I mean, what's obviously with the Minneapolis police, and defund is a word I think that can be misconstrued or maybe not misconstrued, but it's a rethinking of police, right? Like, I think we could just rebrand police as like public safety or something like that, and that alone could start us down the path, because words matter. And maybe the pendulum swings too far to the other side, but then we find something, and I hope that cooler heads prevail. And we do start with this idea of we do have shared values. How are people feeling now, Paul, in your community, as the dust in some ways has settled at the moment?
Well, I think it's there's still daily protests here, and non-trivial ones. I mean, we're still drawing thousands of people at various events. Don't have rioting anymore, which is great. However, I think there's a lot of people really watching Minneapolis closely to see what happens if they're going to they're really going to restructure their police department. How is that going to look? They've made a quick decision to defund the police and reorganize it, but they don't know yet how they're going to do that. And so, I mean, they're identifying the problem. They don't have a solution yet laid out yet. And so there's a lot of people watching that very closely to see what's going to happen. And there's a lot of suggestions being made, but we don't know what that's going to look like yet. But some of the things they're talking about, to me, feel encouraging. For example, if you're a traffic cop, do you need a gun?
Right.
I mean, do you need a gun? You're going to be writing traffic tickets 99.9% of the time. Do you need to be armed? As one example, when there's a domestic violence call, are we sending in two cops, or are we sending in a cop and a mental health worker?
Yes.
It's there to de-escalate the situation. There's a policeman there, so that those are really, really volatile situations. There's a policeman there if you need it, but maybe somebody can talk this thing down rather than having having a loss of life. So those are the kinds of things that are being reimagined, and I think it'll be a fascinating exercise. My hope is that it doesn't become a politicized exercise, so that we can reasonably evaluate it, figure out what's working, what's not working, and build on that, because it won't all be perfect. And I hope the people that, whatever comes of this, I hope we have the objectivity to iterate on the things that aren't working and to make better, rather than just getting entrenched and keeping whatever we had. But it's a fascinating potential experiment if it's done right. And man, we've talked about this broadly, and I've talked about it a lot on the radio in the last 3 weeks, saying you have to be skeptical of the powerful. And the more power we give people, the more power we can give Sigmund, and away from these big, powerful entities that exist primarily to maintain their power structure, whether that's the police union, big corporations, politicians, media. I mean, these are all things that have enormous power and sway, and they do what they have to do to keep their power. And if we can take that power from them and return it to each of us individually, I believe we've got a better society. And the police is one of those power structures. And it's very interesting here. The activist left has attacked a union in a way I've never seen before, and I love it, because the police union here holds, and like they do most places, hold extraordinary power. You can't fire a bad cop, and it's absurd. This is a great opportunity to look at a police union, and even broadly some other unions that I think are fair game as well. But to look, if you've got a police officer who has repeated troubling accusations and disciplines, why can we not fire a known bad cop? And so I think any place that holds power, to me, should be subject to scrutiny at this time.
Absolutely, 100%. And there's so many things touched on. We'll go on forever here. The real one of the things I think you said that is encouraging is communities trying to find solutions. And you mentioned the idea. I know I saw someplace they're talking about sending out a social worker. I think it might be Albuquerque, which is one of the worst police departments in the country. Sending out a social worker to some of these mental health calls instead of a police officer. Like, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, this is again where a problem, I think, was after the war, the second war in Iraq, where a lot of this military equipment was just sitting around. Well, if you give it to police, they're going to start thinking of themselves as occupying forces.
Yeah.
And that, that alienation, everyone comes back to the idea of like what happened to the beat cop who knew everybody in the neighborhood, and how you ferreted out crime was maybe you knew everybody, including some of the shadier characters, so that when something happened, it's like, well, yeah, I know you're like running your numbers game or something, but if something violent happens to something that threatens the peace in the community, you're going to be able to help me out because I'm a police officer and I've earned your respect. So you experiment. Right? It's one of the great things about this country, or at least one of the saving graces of this country, if we can come out stronger, because I'm afraid what's happening right now is exposing the cracks and the flaws. Right? Minneapolis is also where that bridge collapsed. And our infrastructure, in a metaphor that's very direct, is still crumbling in this country. I think the recent history, what we're seeing now in 2020, is exposing the cracks, exposing the flaws, and exposing how this is not sustainable. Or even just comparing like how we've done compared to the rest of the world in containing coronavirus, our hyper individualism, our focus on revenue and production over health of individuals and communities. Our government's very, I mean, I don't even want to say anemic. I mean, it's barely even a response to helping the people during this time.
Yes.
And the tsunami, the economic tsunami, is coming still. The PPP loans are going to run out. The eviction moratoriums are going to run out. A lot of the temporary job losses are going to become permanent. And nobody seems to be thinking about these things or planning for a lot of pain that is coming. And coronavirus is also ramping back up in some places. But on the other hand, America is an open-ended experiment. It's embodied in the way that in this country you can reinvent yourself, right? I mean, that's the envy of everyone around the world. Like, you're rooted in some sort of history and something that your range of possibilities in your life is somewhat limited. Come to America, and you can be anything.
Yeah.
You can reinvent yourself tomorrow. and you can do it. And this country has a long history of widely experimental ways of looking at communities, right? Like back in the 19th century in like upstate New York, there were free love communities. I mean, there were things that a lot of people say, like, what? Yeah. We had this idea of, hey, it's America, come here, try it. I mean, America wasn't about religious freedom it was freedom to be even more repressive, right? Like the Puritans wanted to be even more repressive than the country they're leaving. But the point is, there's this wide range. It's just kind of like football, right? Like here's the rules. As long as you stay within the rules, you can line up however you want and try to accomplish this however you want. So if people create in their communities solutions that work, then they can spread and they can be copied and we can talk to each other. And it's unfortunately, I don't think it's going to come from state governments or the federal government now. I think it's going to come from local governments. But then again, local governments are the ones that actually have to make sure the garbage gets picked up, right? Like they don't just have money to play around with. They don't have money to just enrich their cronies, because if the city is not doing their job, then immediately there are things that come back on them.
Yeah, and you know what? It's funny because at the city level, where you're one step removed from the individuals and your residents. Right. So they're the most accountable. They can impact you very directly. And so I think we get better governance at the city level than we do at the federal level, because it's my neighbor who works at City Hall and I can just go walk, or ride my bike over to City Hall, and I can go have accountability in a way that you don't get with at, say, the federal level. And that's, at the end of the day, who's picking up my trash? It's my city. And that's the level of accountability that I like. And again, just bring it as much as I can, bring the power base back down closer to us. I like that.
And what's great is you see, I think people understanding that the power still resides in the people. The value in the economy comes from the people. Like in so much as their value in the economy, it comes from consumers and workers. Without consumers and workers, and this is the problem we have right now, is like regenerating demand, people feeling safe and things like that. But yes, absolutely question power, because I think you're right, Paul, that there's a pattern that we can see where power almost like metastasizes and then it perpetuates itself, right? Like I'm not necessarily a small government conservative, because in some ways with government, like the federal government, like we couldn't have made inroads against Jim Crow or segregation in the South without something as like big problems require big solutions. And sometimes you need that. But then again, if those big structures are run by someone that's malevolent or only self-interested, then those things can be turned against us. But anyway, my point is, one of the best arguments for small government conservatism is when you see, it's almost like police departments became self-aware, right?
Yeah.
And they learned how to push their energies back to grow themselves, to entrench themselves, and also become revenue generators, right? Because I'm down here in New Orleans where they have the cameras that take your picture and send you, if you went 24 in a 20-mile school zone, you get a ticket in the mail. So it's just ways to generate revenue, feed itself.
It's so wrong. Wrong.
And we can get into the private prison system and how, private prison companies lobby for things like mandatory minimums and longer sentences because that feeds them, right? I mean, it's all just to feed the beast, and we get policies that ruin our communities, but they enrich the individuals who get to decide what the policies are, and we need to tear that whole structure down.
Well, in big corporations, same thing, right? The big corporations generally start as a small company that's scrappy and they've got some product or service that fills a need, and then they grow. And as they grow, they start systematically stifling competition. They create laws and regulations that small companies can't afford to meet, but serve their purposes.
Right.
They hire teams of lobbyists to help shape laws. They fund politicians to help shape laws that keep them strong. They can use media PR companies to help, shape the narrative around what they're doing. And next thing you know, you've got a ton of power built into just the couple of companies that can actually survive in this environment that they built to help perpetuate the strength of their own corporation.
Yeah. So, these are things we're reviewing all this stuff, and it is at least a time that I think people are much more aware. Like, and I think there's a much more actual balanced conversation happening. And while there are forces that want to keep us divided, I think the idea, I've always said, Paul, let's look at where the misery is really coming from, where why people are really struggling, because everyone wants to tell you a different story of why you're struggling. I'll tell you a different story too. And then when we get that, we tear down these power structures that we're talking about. Then we can go back to bickering about all the things we bicker about in a family, because we are a family. You know, we are American through and through, whatever that means. But again, what it does mean is an open-ended story that we're all writing and we're all participating in. And I appreciate always, Paul, anytime we get to spend together. As I said before we came on, there are certain people that you're just in a better mood after you spend time with them. That's Paul Charchian for me, and all the wonderful people in our chat room and all of our communities, whether it's your radio station or other things that give us the opportunity, the privilege of getting to do this, folks. So thank you, everybody. Again, stay safe, mask up, look after yourselves and each other out there, and enjoy the weather. Get out in nature. Disc golf, as my good friend Ray is in the chat room. He's turned me on. There's a disc golf course here, Paul, where they drained a swamp, and you can go disc golfing in the swamp. It's
fun.
Yeah,
All right.
it's a blast. So folks
Disc
out
golf
there,
is cheap. It's cheap and it's effectively free for most places, and it's
yes,
exercise and it's outside and it's fun. It's really fun.
it is. It's just an excuse to take a walk with your friends and enjoy
Yeah,
yourself. And then it
right.
has that challenging aspect of getting better. We are always trying to get better for you folks, because you're so wonderful as an audience to serve. Again, thank you always. You're the best. Stay classy.